The story of manufacturing is, it's really not about anybody stealing our jobs. It's about manufacturers continually trying to find ways to produce their products more efficiently and at lower cost. We didn't steal them. We sent them there by reaching our hand and grabbing shirts that were made in China or buying cars that were made overseas because they were better quality and lower price. We had almost no inflation for 20 or 30 years because we were getting more goods at more economical prices. Once we open our economy up to imports and competition in a global market, customers choose where they find the most value.
Hey y'all, so welcome to the Rio Grande Valley Business Journal's podcast. I'm Kristen Mosbrucker-Garza. I'm a news reporter here, and I have a special guest today. Fun fact, we actually knew each other about 10-12 years ago, so a source of mine from a blast from the past, and I was like, I wonder if Mike Willis is still around, and I was like, sure enough, and making some moves. So welcome, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Mike Willis. I'm the executive director of the South Texas Manufacturers Association. We're the industry trade association for the Rio Grande Valley. We have some maquilas that are members of our association also, that most of them have operations on both sides of the river.
Awesome. And so, I thought this was really interesting because I feel like we hear a lot of talk about manufacturing, but, for folks who aren't very familiar, how significant is it to our economy here? And what does it kind of look like? What are some of the types of companies that are active in the Valley?
Okay, so the economists kind of break up the economy into two big groups: goods producing industries and service industries, right? And nationwide and in the Valley, service industries provide about 80 to 85% of the jobs, and the goods producing about 15%, right? So if you think about the goods producing sectors, energy and mining, you have to drill and mine wherever the resources are, right? You can't decide, I think I'll go, drill a well in Costa Rica because I like it there. You got to go where the oil deposits are, right? Construction companies have to build where the buildings need to be. But manufacturing takes raw materials in, and makes finished products. And they can manufacture anywhere in the world. It's just a function of the cost of labor, the cost of transportation to move the stuff they've made to where it needs to go. So manufacturing has always been a more mobile industry than the other two. And services, you can provide a lot of services over the internet now that you used to not, but a lot of stores and retailers and all that need their stores where their customers are. So this is why a lot of economic development involves helping the companies in all sectors that are in the community, but manufacturing's always been an industry that economic development professionals try to recruit to entice them to come to their area, right? And outsourcing and all that sort of thing is nothing new. Most of my career for 30-some-odd years, much of it in the Valley, was in the apparel industry, the garment industry. The story of manufacturing is, it's really not about anybody stealing our jobs. It's about manufacturers continually trying to find ways to produce their products more efficiently and at lower cost. In the past, labor was a big part of it, and of course transportation costs. But the more we can have automation and technology and all that, we reduce the amount of labor required, and it makes us more competitive with other countries. So economists say that manufacturing should be done where it can be done most economically. And all these jobs that everyone says we stole, from the United States, we didn't steal them. We sent them there by reaching our hand and grabbing shirts that were made in China or buying cars that were made overseas because they were better quality and lower price. So when a country has a lower standard of living and therefore lower labor costs than the United States does, and they're more receptive to helping business to grow and not so restrictive with permitting and all that sort of thing, or environmental regulations maybe, there's an advantage for a company to move their production to those countries. We benefit because we had almost no inflation for 20 or 30 years after horrible inflation in the 70s. because we were getting more goods at more economical prices. And yeah, the companies made a lot more money by moving stuff overseas, and that's probably benefited people that are stockholders more than the people that lost those jobs. But nobody stole the jobs. American consumers basically chose, once we open our economy up to imports and competition in a global market, customers choose where they find the most value. In the garment industry in the 80s, my company was a big supplier for Walmart, which was the up-and-coming retailer, and Penny's and Kmart and Sears and all of them. But it's actually good for consumers that companies have gone overseas. Where we were stupid was letting entire industries that are critical to our national security, like, didn't seem like it then, but now semiconductors, rare earth minerals, steel, aluminum, a lot of defense-type components and all of that, we became too dependent on other countries, so they can blackmail us if they chose to. So that's what's playing out on the big stage right now. Nobody's going to bring 100, 500,000, 3 million manufacturing jobs back to the United States successfully. The companies that are going to build plants in the U.S. that have committed to them, they're going to be highly automated, very technologically advanced, and a lot lower labor content. And those will be better paying jobs. And a lot of Americans don't want to work. I'm not sure I know any Americans that actually want to work in a shoe factory. I'm not sure why we're penalizing shoes made in China or Vietnam with a huge tariff when, if they tried to move those plants to the United States, nobody would want to work in them. So that's kind of the whole big picture issue.
No, it's interesting. And then I remember, I want to say someone had told me about the Rio Grande Valley's history with garment manufacturing and textiles around the time when there was I think it was a Brazilian company that was going to open
Santana Textiles.
Yeah, Santana. And they were going to open like a jeans material factory.
Yeah, it was
here.
going to be a textile factory.
And we hadn't had one in generations, and I do remember that it was going to be much more automated with more robotic aspects to it, which I thought was interesting. So and of course we grow cotton here too, right? So there's always been some sort of there's always been manufacturing in the sense of from agricultural products, right? We had sugar cane and things like that over the years. I kind of wonder, during the time in the 1990s, right? We had this concept of these twin plants, right? Where there would be advanced manufacturing on the U.S. side, and then maybe something that requires more labor-intensive skill sets on the Mexican side. What did that kind of look like, and how did that kind of transform the valley? And is that still happening? Yeah,
that's a good question, because I was kind of right in the middle of that. I was in the apparel industry, which was winding down, and we actually formed the South Texas Apparel Manufacturers Association in 1990. My boss and I did, and it was Levi's, Hager's, Fruit of the Loom. I was with Allison Manufacturing, and so on. It was a few companies. They all had 2 or 3 plants, and each plant had 400, 500, 600 employees. So we had thousands and thousands of employees. But that was right when the maquiladora, that's the twin plant, the maquiladora concept. So companies had already started closing plants in the Midwest and up north and opening new plants in Mexico, right? So Congress thought, you know what, and with a lot of encouragement from border politicians and economic development leaders, why don't we put something together so we can encourage these companies, if they're going to Mexico, at least locate next to the border. And then we get the logistics and the distribution centers and the transportation, and we can put capital-intensive component manufacturing plants. We can get them to locate along the border on the U.S. side to supply the labor-intensive assembly plants in Mexico. So that was the whole concept. And it worked really well. It still works. And that's why probably 30 to 40% of the manufacturing in the valley is tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, component manufacturing companies, plastic injection molding, metal stamping, plating, all these different machining, tool and die shops and all of that. They typically have more of their investment in capital equipment and don't require as many people as an assembly type operation. But what's happened, as you would expect, Mexico's not dumb either, as they've tried to develop a supply chain in Mexico to support their plants instead of depending on us, right? So for years now, our manufacturers have been competing with people who do the same thing in Mexico. So because their labor rates are, 70-80% lower than ours, even in a capital-intensive component manufacturing world, that's enough to make a big difference on the price of your goods. So also the workforce in Mexico, and especially in the maquila industry, has gotten much more sophisticated. A lot of the thousands of jobs that started off on this side of the river for engineers and managers to run the maquilas and provide the engineering services, as you would expect, over the years they've developed and grown their own workforce, and now there's slowly fewer and fewer U.S. paid professionals going across to work. There's still quite a few, but a lot of the management and engineering teams in Mexico now are Mexican nationals who learned the business or went to school and work in those industries. We'd do the same thing if that was on our side of the river. Mm-hmm. So we have a really good relationship, and the maquila industry has been a tremendous asset for the overall economy of the valley. The transportation, warehousing, logistics side of things, and of course the produce industry is not manufacturing, but that's another huge, fast-growing industry that's closely related to manufacturing. So yeah, it's made it challenging for a lot of manufacturing companies along the border. Mm-hmm. So,
it's interesting that you mentioned that concept of the domestic supply chain. I just went to a COSTEP, what is it? Council of South Texas.
Economic Progress. Council for Economic Progress.
Yes.
They're our regional economic development group. They're not tied to one city. They work with everybody.
Right. And so I went to this COSTEP presentation, and there were representatives from the automotive industry, particularly automotive manufacturing, mostly components, from Aguascalientes, so that's like central Mexico. And it was just interesting to kind of hear it from their perspective. So, while much of the news about tariffs has been really from the U.S. side with, President Donald Trump, his policy over the past year has really been to levy various tariffs. I think the highest was like 100 to 150% against imports from China into the U.S. And then, the renegotiation of the USMCA, which is
it's coming up, yeah.
Mm-hmm, which is essentially NAFTA 3.0, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement alternative. And it was just interesting that in Mexico, there are actually new tariffs as of January 1st that for sort of, I don't know if they consider it rare earth, but essentially certain metals. So like copper and steel and some of those raw components that those companies may want to import now are facing 50% import tariffs from all of their non-free trade agreement countries. And so now all these manufacturers are in a situation where, their supply chain is essentially broken, right? And so now they're looking to the valley. They're looking at all their options. Like maybe they can, stand up something that's, a supply chain somewhere in North America so they don't have to deal with the layers of tariffs. And so if you could kind of help people understand, what has the South Texas manufacturing industry gone through in the past year with the tariff situation?
I would say for some companies it's been quite chaotic. For others, they're not that involved with it, but
it's typically a protectionist measure, right?
It's a protectionist, but
especially in steel. Right. The U.S. has a really long history in U.S. steel. Yeah. Chinese steel is still cheaper, but with the tariff, it's more mitigated. It's
a lot more complicated because with the global supply chain and all of that, it's not all. For example, when we did the tariffs on China, okay, we buy a lot of manufactured goods from China, right? they don't buy hardly any manufactured goods from us. So the tariffs aren't going to convince, and we don't make a lot of the stuff in America in manufacturing that China makes. So there's no alternative. So the cost of buying those components or those vehicles or motors or whatever from China goes up 50%. But in many cases, there's not an alternative in the United States because nobody does that in the United States anymore. So all it does is raises the price for the company that resells the products or for the consumers that buy the products. If you're a retailer like, say, Target, and you get all your Christmas toys and goods from China or Vietnam or wherever, because that's where they make them, and you bring them in for Christmas, and there's a 30% tariff. But what China did to retaliate for the tariffs we put on them is they said, you know what do we buy a lot of from America? You know what? We buy 50 million tons of soybeans every year. We can buy soybeans from Brazil. We think we're just going to tell because they're a communist country, we think we'll just tell our country to start buying all their soybeans from Brazil. And what happened? American soybean farmers had a glut of soybeans they couldn't sell. The price plummeted, and the administration had to take many, many, many millions of dollars, as happened in the first term, and compensate farmers for their lost revenue from not being able to sell it to China. And now that we've somewhat fixed the problem with China, a lot of those companies are not going back. They're still buying their soybeans from Brazil because they're companies that decide where they want to source their stuff. So it's really a kind of a messy situation. But I fully agree that like China has subsidized, China plays the long game. You know, they've been quietly subsidizing and supporting their shipbuilding, their crane building, their manufacturing, and all of that, and dramatically growing their raw earth metals. They're really very astute on the business front, but they think in terms of 10 and 20-year windows. We think in terms of 1 or 2 years, typically. You know, so they've basically been able to incentivize the migration of almost all of our metal and aluminum manufacturing and rare earth stuff, where they have the minerals there, but to China. So now they cut us off. The reason we came back on the tariffs, I think, on the first round of punitive tariffs on China is they said, okay, you're going to do whatever it was, 50, 100% tariffs on us. We think we're going to stop shipping you rare earth minerals and magnets for your semiconductors and your jet fighters and your automobiles. We're going to hold off on that for a little while.
That's interesting.
And we said, you know what, we think we're going to ease off on these and negotiate some more with y'all. So it's important that we do some things in the United States, even though it may not be the most low cost or efficient. We've got to be able to take care of ourselves. But I just, to me, we need to be more strategic, and let's identify the things we really need to go after, and not start charging the whole world tariffs for anything and everything that comes from there. To me, the sectoral, they call them sectoral tariffs, or due to national security or whatever, copper, steel, aluminum. But the impact on getting back to the valley, all the economic development corporations around the valley are telling me they've had lots of conversations going on the last year with companies in Mexico about potentially opening up manufacturing in the United States. So a good side of all this tariff stuff is that a lot of countries are starting to realize, you know what, we need to move some of our manufacturing to the United States. President Trump, to his credit, has gotten huge concessions from pharmaceutical companies, tech companies. The semiconductor, a lot of those deals were made under the Biden administration with the CHIPS Act, but President Trump's continued to support and enhance that with tax credits and all that. So we're seeing an explosion of semiconductor plants in Arizona and Texas. I think Samsung has committed to 8 more semiconductor plants in Texas in the next 10 to 15 years. And there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. So, but the problem is with the tariffs, because they're on again, off again, on again, off again, may or may not be legal. Are they going to last past Trump's next term or not? Companies aren't going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars either closing plants and trying to build new plants and worrying about where to find the workforce to work in them in the United States for something that's not going to be permanent. And if tariffs were done by Congress, they'd probably be perceived to have more permanence than when we've had them coming and going for the last year. So everything I've heard and talking to companies too is that nobody's making any major decisions until the whole tariff thing gets settled and there's some kind of stability. Companies can plan for anything. They just need to know what the rules are. Yeah. I have seen two companies. I've visited two companies that are actually moving some production from Reynosa to Hidalgo County. Not big numbers, but it's mostly companies that already have a facility. Some of the automotive plants around the country that were producing in Mexico and the U.S., if they had extra capacity in their plants in the U.S., some of them are shifting some production to Mexico to fill up their U.S. plants to escape, some of the tariffs. So there's some of that going on, but I think we're going to have some stability in the policies before most of the big decisions are going to be made. But there's a lot of other stuff going on in the Valley with manufacturing that's got nothing to do with Mexico or tariffs.
Yeah, I know that there's like a lawsuit out there that some people are like seeking refunds for tariffs, and so there is a lot that I think is going to be shaken out about that. Obviously, probably the most notable manufacturer that we have, I would say, is probably SpaceX, right? They're building that $250 million gigafactory. They have aspirations to manufacture rocket ships, specifically the Starships, right there in Starbase, the new city outside of Brownsville near Boca Chica, and then launch them from there, right? And so, last time I checked, I want to say they had some 3,000 some employees, a couple hundred people living in the city of Starbase. What was it like to get a manufacturer of that caliber for the Rio Grande Valley?
So it was a game changer. From what I've heard, the head count's probably around 4,000 people right now, and I did hear from them. It's publicly known now. They're planning to hire 4,000 more people in 2026.
Wow.
And I know this is not any proprietary information or anything. I'm not sharing anything I have seen there or heard that's not public. But it's an amazing company. I know they're building. There's hotels. I actually got to go through there for the first time about a month ago. So, but they're building I believe I've read that they're building a R&D research facility south of the launch pad. I've read that they're planning to double the launch capacity. And as you can see from learning how to catch their booster rockets, right, that means they're going to try to reuse those and refurbish those and not just dump them in the ocean. So you can see it's just like a lot of other manufacturing, constant process improvement, finding things to make things more efficient. And Elon Musk has been all about disrupting the industry. I can talk a little bit about United Launch Alliance. They were in Harlingen for 35 years, quietly building payload and nose sections for United Launch Alliance rockets in Harlingen. And they closed that facility about 2 years ago, not really because of SpaceX, but I went through there years ago, and they were, to me, there was a big contrast between Elon Musk's philosophy and the tradition in the industry. Everyone walked around, every little piece of metal was picked up and vacuumed and swept when they drilled a hole, and it was all about, we only get one shot at this. If we make a mistake, it could cost $150 million satellite. A little piece of metal could short it out and all that. So the industry's just been, and there's nothing wrong with that, super slow and careful. And I think SpaceX is super careful just like they were. But the philosophy of building one rocket and having it perfect and then it's gone and you got to build another one, he's obviously learning to reuse rockets, and he's using aluminum, steel, rather than all the exotic metals and all that, so the cost is lower. So, they're really disrupting the industry. Look at all the Starlink stuff they've put in. They got internet all over the world. They can turn on the internet for Venezuela or Gaza if they want to, so the citizens, without depending on their government, can get internet access. It's an amazing company, and they've had, from what I can see, they've had no trouble recruiting and attracting people. And I think a lot of people buy into the vision of we're gonna be part of the company that's going to colonize Mars someday. So that's pretty attractive to young people that are interested in that sort of thing.
Something that really struck me about a company like SpaceX is that, the company itself may hire, thousands of employees, but, they probably do a lot of like subcontracting, right? That a manufacturer typically has, business deals with, suppliers and even like metal fabrication, right? Because they're probably not like making the metal. They might do like more assembly kind of stuff like at their facility, but just like making a car, there's a whole supply chain kind of behind them.
Yeah, there's two terms that get thrown around in manufacturing. One is offshoring. That's when you take a plant and close it and build a new one in another country. And outsourcing. So in the 70s and 60s and 50s, a typical auto plant in the U.S. did everything. They did their painting. They made, they did their metal stamping. Their all the processes to make all the subassembled products and all of that. And then as they had to start competing with the Japanese automakers, they started working to improve their quality and lower their costs, and they started outsourcing. It always happened some, but outsourcing to more and more of their production to other companies that could specialize in certain parts of the component manufacturing. So that's what's grown the need for what they call Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers. Tier 2 suppliers make components that they make, and then it typically goes to the assembly plant, the Tier 1, like maybe they make radios or something, and then when they finish, or a console, and then they ship the console to the assembly plant, wherever it is, and they put that in the vehicle. And then there's corrugated box companies that make corrugated boxes for everyone at all three levels to put stuff in when they make it. There's injection molding that makes plastic parts and components of all different sizes. We got one that makes recycled trash can lids and chairs and all of that, and even little bitty tiny parts that go inside of washing machines and radios and electronics components. Metal stampers that have presses that fold and make little metal pieces all the way up to huge pieces. So there's all of that. A lot of that is outsourced, so the assembly plant can focus on what they do the best. So that's the supply chain everybody talks about. And again, you can have that supply chain anywhere depending on what it costs to make it and ship it. And about 5 or 6 years ago, China had a lot of the manufacturing. Well, what's supposed to happen, according to economists, is when you put manufacturing in a country and people get better and better, the quality of life improves, the standard of living improves, and wages rise. Well, China's manufacturing wages rose. They rose to the point where when you add the transportation cost on, it was just as economical to make stuff in Mexico that was being made in China. So 4 or 5 years ago, you started seeing a lot more work starting to gravitate back from China towards Mexico. In the last few years, it's been going to Vietnam. So China's rapidly losing a lot of their, even before the tariff stuff, they've been rapidly losing a lot of their manufacturing capacity. And other less developed countries like Vietnam, Cambodia or whatever, taking full advantage of it. So going back to what I said about manufacturing being something that can be moved anywhere, it's always a race to find the lowest cost place to make things, as long as the quality is good and you're providing the value to the ultimate customers.
I wonder, how would your members, the South Texas Manufacturers Association is a membership organization, right? Y'all are like a nonprofit, 501c3? Yeah,
we're 501c6. We're not a charity. We're like a Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
Except we don't do all the networking. We just focus on, serving the industry.
So
we do have,
lobby,
we've got,
right?
Yeah, we have 100 manufacturing companies in our organization. We also have all the economic development corporations around the valley, almost UTRGV, all the community colleges and tech schools. Now we have some industrial suppliers, logistics companies, and so on. In 2022, after the pandemic, we stopped letting service companies join. So now we're only bringing on, we'll let an economic development corporation or school join, but mostly manufacturing companies. So now our membership is more and more focused on our core customer, which is the manufacturing industry.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say the past year was for your membership? What are some trends that you're seeing? Is our manufacturing industry growing because of some of these new companies, or are we kind of holding stable, or are we a little bit on the decline because we're not as competitive as some other markets?
Yeah, our if you look at the labor market numbers that the Workforce Commission and the feds put out, our manufacturing workforce is hung around 14,000, about 7,000 in Hidalgo and 7,000 in Cameron County for about the last 4 years or so. Well, I see when Keppel Amphols, Cetrium Amphols, grows from 200 people to 3,000, I don't see the numbers change. SpaceX came to town with 4,000 workers, and if they add 4,000 more, I'll be surprised if we see the numbers go up. So all these employment numbers are estimates, and they're based on randomly selected employer surveys every month, quarterly survey of employment and workers or something like that. They call it QCEW. And when I worked at the Regional Workforce Board, I actually filed the Freedom of Information Act thing, and I got it actually in an NDA, and I got a list of all the companies that were in the survey that were divvied up into all the sectors to count the numbers. And without going into particulars, I found some big manufacturing companies. I found one in the automotive industry. It was an automotive company, and they were classified as an auto parts store. And what I found out was the companies themselves, when they do those mandatory surveys, they have to pick what industry code to use. And, the Workforce Commission doesn't have the resources to check every one of them. So I think a lot of them are probably errors in classifying themselves because, they're busy people. They're not experts on the coding for all the different industries in the world, and sometimes they put the wrong number on there, and so they pop up in a different sector.
It's interesting that you say that, and I think that this is something that I've actually run into quite a bit when it comes to getting data about the Valley. We are in a really big state, right? We're at the very tip, we're on the border, and we have 2 metro areas, right? So we have the 2 MSAs, like the McAllen, Edinburgh, Mission, and then we have the Brownsville, Harlingen. Mm-hmm. And I've heard from a lot of industries that it can be difficult to get accurate information about what's happening in the Valley, in part because a lot of the data doesn't include the activity in Mexico, right? Because mm-hmm. that's sometimes hard to track depending on what you're looking at. We have kind of these 2 MSAs that don't necessarily include our entire coverage area, like all 4 counties. Mm-hmm. Even on the housing side of it, it's just like there's a lot of like gaps in between just because of how unique this area is geographically, mm-hmm. and we have grown so much too. And so I'm not surprised to hear you say that, I guess is my point.
Well, it's not unique to the Valley. That data process happens all over the country. Mm-hmm. So it's not a bug in the Valley's data. I'm sure goes on everywhere. So the numbers, the process and the methodology has been pretty consistent over the years. It doesn't change just because a president or anyone changes. So, they do the best they can. The word in front of all these numbers is always estimates. No one counts how many people are unemployed. Those are household surveys and variables that are used based on the change in the rate of unemployment and the long-term unemployed. They have all these complicated 130 different variables that go into a lot of this data. So it's really hard to get your hands around. So my feeling is probably half the jobs we've lost in manufacturing are due to companies moving overseas and Mexico and all that. But the other half is a good thing if you're a company person because they've lowered their labor costs, which means they don't have to charge as much for their goods and services. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. So the shrinking workforce and I mean, back in the 70s and 80s in the garment industry, we were constantly introducing new technology and improved methods and all that to increase productivity and lower our labor costs. So that's nothing new for manufacturing. We've called them green jobs and, all of that, but the process, and now we call it advanced manufacturing and all that, but manufacturing's always been advancing and continuously finding new and better ways to do things all over the world.
On the workforce side, something I've been thinking about, because I know Texas A&M University has that advanced manufacturing center near Rio Grande LNG, right? They are training a lot of welders and folks on the construction side. Does the Valley have the workforce for the manufacturing industry that's here and the industries that want to come here?
Well, that's a loaded question because, I think nationwide there's, I forget whether the number's, at least 400,000, it may be higher than that, unfilled manufacturing openings at any given time. And it's a function of, let me answer it this way. We don't have thousands of openings that aren't being filled. It's a lot easier to fill the manufacturing job openings now than 2 or 3 years ago when we had a really tight labor market, and back in 2018-19 before the pandemic hit. It's still challenging, but we have plenty of training programs in our high schools and community colleges. Our organizations work with all TSTC, Southmost. We work with TMAC. We've participated with A&M, the group you talked about, and excuse me. They develop academic programs, and the schools all have strong customized training programs where not just for students, but they'll go out and work with the companies and train their employees. STC, TSTC, Southmost, the group at A&M, TEACS, and TMAC, our friends at TMAC. They all provide training to train up employees and even unemployed people. And the Workforce Commission has skills development grants and money the state puts aside that companies and schools can partner to pay for training. The challenge is finding enough people that want to work in manufacturing. A lot of young people aren't interested in manufacturing. They want to, 10 years ago, they all wanted to be graphics designers. Now they want to be social media influencers or whatever the current thing is. So that's one of the challenges. But most of the graduates in a lot of these academic programs that we graduate from our schools don't go to work here. They leave the Valley because the wages for manufacturing jobs are about 15 to 35% higher in Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and so on. So a lot of them will go there and work. And then maybe years later when they have experience, they might come back and find a job here in the Valley. Some of them do go to work in the Valley, but a lot of them do leave to work for higher paying jobs elsewhere. So the challenge isn't just in the Valley with the workforce. There's a huge shortage of workers all over Central Texas. There's semiconductor plants, battery plants, Tesla. There's just a lot of job, and we haven't even scratched the surface of all the semiconductor plants that are going to be opening. In Arizona, there's going to be, I think President Trump announced 500, Taiwan doubled their commitment Taiwan companies doubled their commitment from $250 billion to $500 billion worth of semiconductor plants and foundries in Arizona. A lot of it's in Arizona. And they can't even find the people qualified to build the factories, much less to work in them. So we've got a lot of challenges on the workforce development. And if we think we're going to dramatically grow the manufacturing, we've got to have the wages to attract people into those jobs and people willing to do that kind of work. So that's part of it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So as far as the manufacturing industry, it's been very sluggish and somewhat, and I'm talking overall, sluggish and slow for the last 2 years. Didn't just happen this year. It's been that way for about 2 years. That's supported by the Federal Reserve's, survey of Texas manufacturers, so it's just not my opinion. As I mentioned, short term, the tariffs are having a lot of disruption. The poor customs brokers, every time a new tariff is announced, they have to go in and reprogram all their software and retrain their people. This item now is going to be this tariff rate. If it's this item and it's from this country, it's fine. But if it's this item from this country, there's this tariff, and this country is this tariff. So it's very confusing. Hopefully there'll be some resolution on it soon. But on the good side, the tariff deals, the tariffs, pressure from the tariffs and the CHIPS Act, residue from the CHIPS Act that the Biden administration passed is driving major semiconductor foundry investments. We had a lot of wind energy and green energy projects. Some of them are still going on, but some of them have been frozen. They had their funding and their contracts frozen. They're seeking redress through the courts. One of the big wind farms just got approved by a court to restart.
I just heard a story the other day about a solar farm that was supposed to open near Lynn in northern Hidalgo County. And they were out of North Carolina. They had announced, I can't remember how big it was, but it was a pretty sizable utility scale solar farm. And the company filed for bankruptcy because of the change in policy. So, we definitely see a lot of that trickle down.
There's a lot of, in all fairness, the government had allocated a lot of big incentives because they were completely focused on electric cars and wind and solar energy. Now, the truth is most companies, including our big tech companies, are very supportive of wind and solar energy, and some of them are a little aggravated that a lot of those projects around the country are not carrying forward because they feel like, especially with all the data centers, we're going to need all the energy we can generate. Texas generates, I think, 40% of our electricity is generated by wind. We're one of the most diverse alternative energy states in the country. So there were a lot of companies in Texas that were dependent on all that. But in all fairness, it was heavily subsidized, and I think all we did was took a lot of the subsidies away and trying to let those sectors stand on their own 2 feet, and it's not going so well. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of like changing the rules of the game after they've already taken the field.
Yeah. Would you consider a data center a manufacturer?
No. I don't. I'd have to. It's a new category, but I think it would fall under. They're a consumer of electricity, right? I think they're going to fall in the information technology space, probably, which is, I guess, business and professional services.
Yeah, and they really don't create a lot of on-the-ground jobs either.
No. Actually, the information technology, IT, is a sector to itself. I didn't even mention it because it's like 1%, even smaller. But the reason it's 1% is because, and I've had my discussions with my friends at Workforce Solutions about this too, there aren't that many companies that's what they do, right? But there's people in every company, every bank, every manufacturing company, every college, every city that are IT professionals, right? So they're part of city government or part of a manufacturing company, but what are they? They're IT professionals. So the classification is by what the company does. They can't possibly break out every employee in every company in the country and figure out which category, what kind of work they do. So while you don't see a lot of IT companies, if you look at the employment numbers, there's lots of information technology and, programmers and jobs like that in the workforce. They're just working for companies providing those services inside of other sectors.
That's interesting. I wonder, what are some things you're looking forward to here in 2026 that is in the manufacturing industry that you are kind of watching for? I had seen a couple months ago there was potentially going to be an announcement about like a new pretty major 600-person manufacturing company. They were scouting out a community like Harlingen. And I wonder, are we going to see an announcement like that? Or are we going to see companies finally making decisions in 2026?
Well, I think it depends on who the prospect or the company is. But like I said, a lot of them are making contingency plans so that once the tariff picture clears, they can make a final decision about what they want to do. But it's always been the case that I worked with a lot of the EDCs around the valley, both in this job, and I also was a business service manager for the Regional Workforce Solutions Board office for 10 years or so. And I was the one who met with the EDCs also. So I sat with a lot of site selectors, and I've sat with people from automotive plants, transportation plants, manufacturing plants at the table, giving labor market information, talking about the industry. And of course, I can't talk about any of that, even the stuff in the past. But it's not uncommon at all for a project or a prospect to take 3 to 5 years. I can remember working at Workforce Solutions with Rio Grande LNG next decade and Inova and Texas LNG in 2015, giving them information about the workforce and talking to the colleges about what kind of training programs were going to be needed and all that. So it took years and years and years. We got one of them going. Inova started and then pulled away and decided not to go forward. And I think their name's still Texas LNG. The smaller one is making their final investment decision. They've gotten all their permits. So, and the other thing is the EDCs have non-disclosure agreements, because what happens if the newspaper starts reporting that, oh, this company's thinking about buying 1,000 acres around Harlingen or Lafaria or McAllen for a new manufacturing plant? People run out and start buying up land, and the landowners raise their prices and all of that sort of thing. So people try to figure out how can it benefit them. So the hallmark of a professional economic development organization is that stuff stays confidential. Most of the time, the city won't even know about it until it's time to ask for incentives. And then there's a confidentiality agreement that goes along with that. But I think most of our economic development corporations, or especially the bigger ones, are very optimistic. They have some very good prospects. In Brownsville, they have a lot of prospects that have nothing to do with Mexico. They have to do with the aerospace industry and proximity to the port of Brownsville. I mean, Brownsville and the port area have been on fire the last 5 years, and they've got between the port and GBIC, the Greater Brownsville Incentives Corporation, they've got tons of prospects that have very little to do with tariffs, I think, that are in the pipeline already. So I'm optimistic. I think for the first time in many years about manufacturing growing. I think we're going to see a lot more manufacturing jobs, and we're going to start screaming about the need for more people. I also think I warned my members, pointed out to my members at our meeting, last week that, on the immigration front, I'm down with, following the law and all that. But the reality is, because, in my opinion, neither political party has been willing to fix an easy fix to our immigration problem by greatly expanding our agriculture and technical and H-1B visa programs, where people are vetted, allowed to come into the country. They have to pay taxes, but they never get benefits. And they come over here and work, and we know where they are. They work legally, but neither party has wanted to expand those. Every year we have 300,000 agriculture work permits, H-2A visas, that are filled like the first week they're made available. And those people get screened, they come over, they work in the fields. A lot of them are the same people that come year after year, and then they go home. So instead of having 40% of our agricultural workers illegal immigrants, why don't we allow – Americans don't want to work in the fields. I mean, they're offering $16, $18 in California and other places for people to work for the farmers, and nobody wants to do it. How many Americans want to work in a meat packing plant? In Arkansas, when I lived and worked up there was a turkey processing plant, and they had job titles like eviscerator. And I'm not going to describe in the media what that job involved, but you hear a lot about, in manufacturing, a lot of the meat packing employees are not documented. We know 30 or 40% of the construction industry, probably the smaller companies that don't use E-Verify, have undocumented people working for them. In agriculture, it's something like 60%. So who's going to fill those jobs? So what I've told my people is, look, let's say we've deported 500,000 or 1 million workers, or have that many either deported or not, afraid to go to work or whatever. Again, I don't have a problem with following the law. I'm just pointing out the economics of it. So who's going to pick the crops, and who's going to build all the manufacturing plants that we think we're going to bring back to the United States if we've lost 40% of the construction industry? So those industries are going to have to dramatically raise their wages and find more workers. Well, I'm worried about them recruiting manufacturing workers, and then our companies having trouble holding on to their people, and so on, you know. So some people would argue, well, great, we raise wages. That's good for everybody. Well, it's not good for the companies because they have to compete, and if they raise their prices, we have higher prices. So it's a complicated situation, but to me, we could, and I won't get into the politics of it. Both political parties have political reasons why they don't support a more broad-based immigration reform program. I know Jamie Dimon at Chase Bank advocated for that publicly, stuck his neck out there yesterday. But we got programs that already work we've been using for generations if we just use them. But for some reason, neither political party, I'm an equal opportunity offender, wants to address the problem. So
yeah,
I'm worried about the pressure it's putting on the workforce. It's already we don't have enough births every year to replace us baby boomers that are leaving the workforce. The immigrants, legal and otherwise, have helped prop our economy up for the last 10 to 20 years. So we've got to be strategic about it is all I'm saying. I don't have all the answers. I'm just trying to anticipate problems for our members.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the immigration policies, kind of the impact of those on our economy and the potential workforce is really going to start shaking out, whether it's, lower consumer demand for, goods and services, maybe a bit more sluggish economy, or just, simply lack of workforce in a lot of industries. Was there anything else that you wanted to highlight you think is important that people should know, or you think I might be missing in all this that you wanted to add?
I do want to throw in there that on the other side of on the question about undocumented workers, it's not fair to companies who do hire, who do screen for Social Security numbers and pay good wages and hire, legitimate U.S. workers to compete with companies who don't. So that's the other side of it, and that dynamic is one reason why wages are so low in the Valley, I think, historically. So that's the other side of that. I didn't want to leave that out. There is a good argument for, making companies, making sure that companies compete fairly, and to do that you got to follow the law. But I just think the government needs to find legal ways for companies to be able to do that. I thought you asked me about new manufacturing companies in the region. Of course, SpaceX is an obvious one. Linde is opening up a chemical processing plant making industrial gases out in Brownsville. I would guess that's for SpaceX, but I don't know that. We have a company called Forza Steel in Brownsville, opening a steel fabrication plant, 650,000 square foot manufacturing plant. They're going to make steel tubing and pipes for construction and oil and gas industries and manufacturing.
And that's in Brownsville.
In Brownsville.
Right, at the port.
Of course, SpaceX is expanding their Gigabay and hiring thousands more people this year. Rich Products in Brownsville spent about $177 million expanding their food processing facility there. It's an amazing operation, a great company. In Farr, Master Brands, previously known as Woodcrafters, has finished a 1 million square foot distribution center in Farr. And I don't know, but I would bet that they're also looking at, with the tariff situation, since they make bathroom vanities and furniture and cabinets and all that, they probably got plenty of room if they wanted to put manufacturing here. I don't know if they are or not. Zoho is a company that Keith Patridge and Ralph and the folks a couple of years ago at MEDC were recruiting to come to McAllen, and they've relocated to Edinburgh. They bought the Echo Hotel to be an administrative offices and a training place for their facilities, and they bought a bunch of land, according to Edinburgh EDC, on North 281, and they're going to open up a huge campus and operation there. And I've been told they eventually will do some manufacturing there. They're a Indian software company, but they're also planning to get into manufacturing. So I think we'll hear more news on that in the future. In Reynosa, LG is expanding their facility there, a couple $100 million or $100 million investment. On the downside, Regal Rexnord closed a factory in Reynosa and moved it to Piedras Negras, where they have another factory. The Brunswick Boat manufacturing plant in Reynosa is closing as we speak. They're consolidating all their operations in, I think it's Kentucky. But I haven't kept up really well with the maquila industry, actually, for the last couple of years. I've slowed down a bit. You know, there's always companies open, smaller companies opening and closing. There's a lot of entrepreneurs. We've got companies with two people where an engineer and a mechanic got together and they're building machinery or fabricating machines. And there's CNC machine shops with just a couple of people. One lady has a 3D printing operation where she just makes with a 3D printer, makes stuff for people. So there's manufacturing is everything, like I said, potato chips to rocket ships, sign shops, welding shops, tortilla factories, all the way to SpaceX. That's all manufacturing. So it's a huge, broad industry. Mm-hmm. And there's career paths for the larger companies inside a manufacturing plant for young people. In a typical manufacturing plant, you've got mechanics, maintenance supervisors, maintenance managers, you've got machinists, and if it's metalworking, you've got machine operators, different levels of machine operators, quality inspectors, quality technicians, you've got accounting, human resources, customer service, purchasing. So there's all these different fields inside of manufacturing, and you can become proficient in those fields and work your way up in a company or go to a different company or even go to a different industry with those skills.
Yeah, I think the workforce development side of it, of like, you know, how we kind of build out our talent pool when it comes to the manufacturing sector in the Valley is something that I think is really interesting. And it's something that I'm watching in particular, especially as so many economic development organizations seek to like attract, because a lot of times I think, you know, companies, yes, they want the infrastructure, they want the access to electricity, but it really sometimes comes down to, do you have the skilled workforce?
Yeah. And one advantage I've always promoted when I've met with EDCs with relocation prospects and everything is the Valley's population growth. It's slowed down from years ago, but we're still growing at our population at twice the rate the rest of the United States is. Texas is growing pretty fast, but the Valley's still faster than Texas. So one thing we tell companies when we meet with them is that, you know, where are you going to go to have a future workforce, right? So that's one of the advantages of the Rio Grande Valley. So what we need is ways to train our people, and that's why STMA's been working all these years developing programs to support manufacturing with all the colleges and some of the high schools and stuff. So I think we're going to get our share.
Yeah, certainly. Well, it's something that we're watching, but thank you so much for carving out some time to chat with us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening.
And so stay tuned, and subscribe to the Rio Grande Valley Business Journal podcast.